I was in my garden having a cigarette and I heard a gentleman shouting from a distance away. I went out into my road to investigate and basically he was just shouting for help and... Excuse me, mate. Excuse me. Hello? Yeah. What's happened, please?
Somebody threw acid over there. Can you see
Someone
that?
threw acid over his face, apparently.
There's acid thrown over his face?
Yeah.
Okay, bear me a second. Is the attacker still nearby?
Who did it to you, please?
My ex,
His ex.
All right, my love. Is she still there? Has she gone?
Is he or she still here?
I don't know.
He doesn't.
That's okay. That's all right, my love. Don't worry.
Yeah, no,
okay.
He's on the way.
So you have acid thrown over his face?
And body, yeah.
September 23rd, 2015, Bristol, England. Mark Van Dongen is woken up by the sound of his ex-girlfriend laughing. And before he can wake up, let alone fully grasp what's happening, he feels an unbearable burning sensation all over his face and upper body. Realizing immediately that he needs help, Mark ran screaming out of the apartment into the street. He was then rushed to a hospital where he received treatment for months. However, Mark sadly would succumb to his injuries just over a year later. His tragic death left one question unanswered. Was his ex-girlfriend responsible in the eyes of the law? This is the story of Berlinah Wallace. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi. My name is Jessica, and welcome to my channel, where I explore new true crime cases each week. Last week, I finished up my Louisiana serial killer series, and I have to say, it feels pretty good knowing that our story today does not take place in Louisiana. We're gonna give them a break. If you haven't seen that series and you're interested, I will make sure to have it linked up in the card here for you. And if you just have an interest in true crime in general, like me, and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. Before I get started today, I do have something that I want to add in at the beginning here. Being that I am a true crime channel, I don't always find it necessary to put a bunch of extra disclaimers at the beginning of my videos because, I feel like it's implied that the subject matter isn't necessarily going to be easy to digest. But there are some subjects that I will always feel warrant a little bit of an extra warning before I dive in. And today's story has all of those subjects. Today's case covers topics of rape, domestic abuse, suicide, and some fairly graphic descriptions of injuries. So if you are sensitive to any of those topics, I urge you to do what is best for you. And if that happens to be not watching this video, that's fine. I'm sure I will catch you in an upcoming one. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Guys, I was so done with Louisiana that I left the country for today's video. Berlinah Wallace was born in South Africa in the late 1960s, where she lived throughout most of her early life with her mother and stepfather. However, that time in her life is not thought to have been particularly happy. She reportedly suffered from abuse at the hands of her parents, had a baby at age 14 that eventually passed away, and also had a boyfriend of hers die as well. And as if that wasn't a terrible enough start to Berlinah's life, when she was just 20 years old, she was the victim of a really brutal gang rape where she reportedly contracted HIV. Understandably so, Berlinah needed a fresh start far away from where all of these horrible things had happened to her. So as a young adult, she relocated to the United Kingdom. Despite the distance she had managed to put between her and her upbringing, the trauma that she had experienced in South Africa seemed to have already done substantial psychological damage to Berlinah. She was known to have difficulty regulating her emotions and often was just angry. She is also reported to have suffered from depression and anxiety. And with everything that took place throughout the first 2 decades of her life, I really can't say that I blame her for being depressed, anxious, and angry. Shit, on any given day, I can be all of those things, and I have not experienced even a quarter of the trauma that Berlinah has. When Berlinah was in her early 40s, she met a man named Mark Van Dongen on a dating website that specifically catered to individuals living with HIV. Mark was born in the Netherlands in the late 1980s to a very close-knit family. Mark was close to everyone in his family, but he had an especially close relationship with his father, who would later describe him as a loving and gentle person who was too good for this world. Mark was in his early 20s when he met Berlinah, which would put her about 20 years his senior. But that didn't matter to Mark. He was inspired and comforted by Berlinah. Having recently been diagnosed with HIV, Mark found hope in Berlinah, knowing that she had been living with the virus for over 20 years. She made him feel as if being diagnosed with HIV didn't mean his life was immediately over. Mark was still living in the Netherlands when he and Berlinah began dating, so for the first year of their relationship, he would frequently make the trip to and from Bristol to visit her. But once the couple had been together for a year and they started to get more serious, Mark decided to relocate to Bristol to pursue their relationship. After moving, Mark was able to quickly secure a job as an engineer for a construction company, and with that salary, he was able to comfortably support he and Berlinah. From the outside looking in, the couple appeared happy. They had a lot of friends, they enjoyed going out, and they loved to travel. They just seemed normal. And at the beginning of stories like this, they always do. But behind closed doors, Berlinah was quickly becoming controlling and physically abusive to Mark. I want to make a quick note here that domestic abuse can happen to absolutely anyone. While it's commonly thought of and portrayed as violence from a male partner towards a female partner, men can also be victims of physical abuse at the hands of their partners. Female-to-male domestic violence is more rare. It's typically fueled by anger, jealousy, and/or a desire for attention. And it accounts for about 10% of all reported domestic violence cases. However, that number is believed to be inaccurately low because men are believed to be much less likely to report abuse at the hands of their partner. With that said, if you or someone you know is suffering from violence at the hands of a partner, please know that there are people waiting to help you. If you're in the United States, I will have the phone number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline listed on the screen. And beyond that, I will also list some helpful resources in the description box down below. Sorry to get off track there, I just really hate the idea of anyone living in fear within their own home. Berlinah also alleges to have suffered abuse at the hands of Mark. And obviously, I can't refute that. I mean, it's surely possible. But there is no tangible evidence to corroborate those claims, and people who knew them personally only describe Berlinah as having been aggressive in the relationship. Mark actually made claims that Berlinah would physically injure herself and then threatened to report him for domestic abuse if he ever tried to leave her, and that she was constantly trying to instigate fights, often over some really petty, trivial bullshit. She also frequently made outrageous claims of infidelity, even though Mark was reportedly always faithful to her and never gave her a reason to believe that he wasn't. And it doesn't end there, because you could also say that Berlinah financially abused Mark. She didn't work and lived solely off of Mark's salary, but on top of that, she was sending substantial amounts of money to her family back in South Africa. Now, whether Mark knew about this or not, can't say. Berlinah basically tried to control every aspect of not only their relationship, but Mark's entire life. She would even hide his passport from him in an effort to ensure that he could not leave her. Their relationship was very clearly toxic and messy. At one point, one of their arguments got so out of hand that Berlinah decided to scald Mark with boiling water. Initially, when seeking treatment for his burns, Mark told medical professionals that it had been an accident. But he later admitted that Berlinah had thrown the boiling water on him on purpose during an argument. When asked later what they were actually fighting about, Mark stated that it was such an insignificant matter that he literally could not remember. With all of that background information, I'm sure it's not surprising that Mark and Berlinah broke up and got back together quite frequently, which I feel like is pretty typical in volatile relationships like this. Mark said that he always ended up back with Berlinah because he felt bad for her. Despite this, he did eventually tell his close friends and family that he was scared of her. He even supposedly would show them marks on his body that had come from Berlinah's abuse. After hearing this, people became very concerned for Mark's well-being, as anyone would. People really started to feel as though Mark loved and cared for Berlinah much more than she loved or cared for him. And he must have started to get the same vibe, because finally, in the summer of 2015, Mark and Berlinah separated, and it seemed as though this time it was for good. Mark even began seeing another woman during this time, despite the fact that he was still living with Berlinah. This living arrangement was not meant to be long-term, though. Mark ended up moving out of the apartment that he shared with Berlinah and temporarily into a hotel before he settled in with his new girlfriend. But right after Mark moved out, Berlinah called him distraught, claiming to have overdosed. It's my understanding that she kind of painted this as a suicide attempt. Obviously, I don't know for sure, but that's kind of what I took away from it. Probably because in abusive relationships, it's super common for suicide threats to be used to either guilt a partner into staying or guilt them into returning. So maybe that's why I read into it like that. Regardless of if that was truly her intention, it's what ended up happening. This call led Mark straight back to Berlinah. Sidebar, present-day Berlinah claims that she never overdosed. She claims that she had simply been upset about not being able to financially support herself when she'd called Mark. Honestly, the meat and potatoes of the conversation really doesn't matter. We'll never know what was truly discussed. The point is that Mark briefly ended up back with Berlinah, but it really didn't take long for them to resume their back and forth, on and off again routine. Mark actually ended up having to report Berlinah to the police for harassment in August of 2015, because she not only sent him a slew of harassing text messages, but she also, heavy breather called his girlfriend Violet multiple times just to hang up. At first, Mark really tried to de-escalate the situation. He even offered to continue financially supporting Berlinah until she was able to get back on her feet. But the gentle approach did not work, which is why Mark had to file the police report. The police then contacted Berlinah and issued a verbal warning for her to stop contacting Mark and Violet, because you know verbal warnings and their 100% efficacy rate. Berlinah, on the other hand, denies having ever harassed Mark or Violet and notes that Mark's claims were humiliating. She was so upset by this, in fact, that day she went online and purchased a bottle of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. Just had that shit Amazon Primed right to her doorstep. The day after that, Berlinah had a mental health episode and reached out to a crisis hotline before overdosing again. I say again as if she really did overdose the first time. No one knows for sure about that one. This one, after she called the crisis hotline, was for real though. Can be verified through medical records. She was admitted to the hospital for about 24 hours before she was released. Berlinah's version of events is that when Mark found out what happened, he called her and expressed his undying love for her and requested, or begged rather, that they reconcile. And while Mark was allegedly professing his love, I say allegedly because that's Berlinah's story and it can't be confirmed or debunked, so while Mark was allegedly professing his love, Berlinah was doing some internet research. She's plugging into the old Google things like sulfuric acid. What happens if you drink sulfuric acid? Acid attack. What happens if you throw sulfuric acid on someone? Photos of acid victims. And the case of Katie Piper, which, if you don't know that story, stick that one into your own Google machine because it's also quite a doozy. But Berlinah literally made upwards of 80 different searches of this nature right after being released from the hospital. During this time, she also received the bottle of sulfuric acid that she'd ordered online, which she promptly removed the warning label from. And all of that brings us to the night of September 23rd, 2015. There are conflicting reports about how Mark ended up at Berlinah's that night. Some reports say that the two had plans to have dinner there together, and some reports say that Berlinah manipulated Mark with tearful phone calls and threats of self-harm until he agreed to come over. Who's to say which version is the factually accurate version? Point is, the outcome was the same. Mark did end up at Berlinah's. And not surprisingly, they ended up in a pretty heated argument almost immediately. No one knows what the argument was about, but it was serious enough that Berlinah left her own apartment to spend the night in a hotel while Mark slept at her place. The problem was that Berlinah didn't actually stay at a hotel. She returned back to her apartment where she woke Mark up with maniacal laughter at 3 a.m. while she stated, "If I can't have you, no one can." She then proceeded to pour a cup of sulfuric acid over Mark while he laid in bed. The acid instantly began severely burning Mark's skin. Mark later stated that he immediately began screaming and ran out of the apartment into the middle of the street. 25% of Mark's body had been burned by the acid, with his face and upper body taking most of the damage. As he stood screaming in the middle of the street, neighbors obviously began coming outside to see what was going on. Again, I urge you to exercise caution in proceeding through the video because what happened to Mark is horrifying. When the neighbors got to Mark, his face was literally melting off. He was missing an eye, an ear, and his nose, all of which had been completely eaten away by the acid. Paramedics were called and Mark was escorted into one of the neighbors' homes until they arrived. They put him under cool running water in hopes of either rinsing off any remaining acid and or providing some sort of relief to his burns. However, I don't think at that point anything could relieve that type of pain. Despite Mark's agony, he was still able to muster up enough strength to tell his neighbors that Berlinah had been the one to do this to him. She had thrown the acid at him. And while in the ambulance, Mark also told paramedics who was responsible for doing this to him. Neighbors and first responders thankfully ended up relaying this information to police. Mark was obviously in very critical condition when he reached the hospital, so he was immediately sedated. And while Mark clung to life, police went out looking for Berlinah. When they arrived at her apartment, she was just sitting on the couch, looking all confused. It was obvious to police that the incident had taken place in that apartment because the bed and sheets were also badly burned from the acid. Berlinah was taken into custody and questioned the following day. Her version of events was that Mark was violent and abusive towards her, that they had gotten into a fight that evening and Mark had been the one to escalate things to physical violence. Because of this, she reached for what she thought was an innocent glass of water to throw at him. She simply had no idea that the liquid in the cup was sulfuric acid, and that Mark must have been the one to fill the cup with acid for her to drink in an attempt to murder her. Ridiculous, right? Yeah, she must have realized that too, because her story will change a couple times. She later tried to explain that because she was a part-time fashion student at University of West of England in Bristol, that she had purchased the acid to distress clothing. Unfortunately for Berlinah, this story was also preposterous to police. It was obvious to police that Berlinah had not been surprised that the liquid in the cup was acid, because when Mark started screaming and ran out into the street, she made no attempts to help him in any way. Instead, she had actually called one of her friends, much like our old friend Sheila did after she stabbed her husband. Just a quick heads up, calling your friend or your lover after you try and kill your partner, not a great look. Because Berlinah's story was so clearly a load of crap, she was ultimately charged with throwing a corrosive substance with intent and held in custody to await trial. While Berlinah sat in jail, Mark spent 11 months in intensive care, the first of which he spent in a coma. And when he finally came to, he was unable to communicate in any way. But about 4 months into his recovery, he did learn to communicate by sticking out his tongue while looking at a letterboard. While Mark had completely lost one eye due to the severity of his burns, they managed to save his other eye, which he did regain very limited use of. He was eventually transferred to a burn unit where he underwent multiple skin grafts and other medical procedures. Eventually, he had had so much done that 40% of his body was covered in either skin grafts or burns. He'd also been paralyzed from the neck down and forced to amputate his left leg. During his attempts at recovery, he was given the strongest pain medicine available, and it didn't even put a dent in the excruciating pain he was experiencing. He also suffered from numerous infections all over his body. He developed issues with his kidneys and his bowels. And on top of that, he was just constantly itchy. I mean, he was just totally and completely miserable. There are no words that can even begin to accurately capture what he must have been going through. A representative from the hospital noted that Mark's were the most severe injuries they'd ever seen from a chemical attack. And we haven't even talked about the injuries that couldn't be seen. Following the attack, Mark began suffering from severe depression and PTSD, which can't come as a shock to anyone. Mark's biggest support system throughout this entire ordeal was his father, Keys, who didn't leave his side for the first 4 months following the attack. Even at that point, after he returned to work, he was still at the hospital every weekend. At one point, Mark ended up back in the ICU after he developed a pretty serious infection in his lungs. This was particularly devastating to Mark because he had very recently regained his ability to speak. And the infection meant that a tube would have to be put down his throat in order to drain the fluid from his lungs. This would, once again, temporarily impede his ability to speak, but if he didn't have the procedure done, he would likely die from the infection. Finally, after a year in the hospital, Mark was transferred to a long-term care facility, which sounds like a good thing. But Mark was extremely unhappy with the facility. He felt that the care he was now receiving paled in comparison to the care he'd been receiving at the hospital. So, with his family's guidance and support, Mark made the decision to move to Belgium in hopes of receiving better care with the added benefit of being closer to his family. Despite the move, despite the treatment, despite the procedures, Mark continued to experience setback after setback in his recovery. But the final straw for Mark was when he experienced another lung infection that, if treated, would likely leave him unable to speak permanently. This was officially too much for him to bear, which led him to apply for voluntary euthanasia. To clarify, voluntary euthanasia is not the same thing as assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is where a person plays a part in their own suicide versus voluntary euthanasia, where a person is medically released. With voluntary euthanasia, a medical professional solely takes on the responsibility of humanely ending a person's suffering. I'm really trying to use words that are as gentle as possible here, so if you are still confused about the differences, I urge you to do your own research outside this video. While illegal in the United States, euthanasia is permissible in Belgium as well as a handful of other countries. The circumstances in which it is permitted vary from country to country, but for the sake of this case where we are specifically speaking about Belgium, the criteria there is that the patient must be legally competent, the patient must be making the request voluntarily, the patient must be in a medically futile condition and experiencing constant and unbearable suffering that cannot be alleviated. Alternative avenues of care regarding the patient's condition must be discussed. The physician must consult with other physicians regarding the possibility of euthanasia. Then it must be determined by the physician and the patient together that there truly are no other alternatives to improve the patient's condition. Mandatory consultations concluded that Mark did in fact meet the criteria and his request for voluntary euthanasia was approved. However, it was required that he wait at least 1 month between making the decision and the act being carried out. And after 15 months of unbearable suffering, Mark van Dongen died via voluntary euthanasia at 7:15 p.m. on January 2nd, 2017. Okay, try and finish this up here. Following Mark's death, Berlinah's charges were modified to include murder, and her trial began in November of 2017. During the trial, the defense argued that what Berlinah had done did not directly result in Mark's death, therefore she could not be charged with murder. They stated that if anyone was responsible for Mark's death, it was the doctors in Belgium. And the judge agreed, and she was acquitted. But the prosecution was not having that. They appealed the judge's decision, and in response, the Court of Appeals called for a retrial, but this time it would be a jury trial versus a bench trial, and it was set to begin in early 2018. The biggest issue everyone seemed to have when charging Berlinah with Mark's death was, should she be charged with murder or should she be charged with manslaughter? During the trial, Berlinah did choose to testify on her own behalf, which typically is not recommended by a defense team. However, according to Berlinah, she was a victim as well. Therefore, she took the stand to testify about the domestic abuse that she had allegedly suffered at the hands of Mark. I want to make it abundantly clear that I'm not saying she was or wasn't abused. I'm saying allegedly because it's just never been proven one way or another. I would never discount someone's claims of abuse, so... During her testimony, Berlinah did admit that she had often been mean and violent towards Mark as well. She also, once again, changed her story as to why she had purchased the acid in the first place. It was no longer purchased to help further her fashion career, rather just to clean out her drains. Regardless of what her story was at any given moment, Berlinah always maintained that she had never purchased the acid with the intent to harm Mark. She cried on the stand, claiming that she had loved Mark and that because she had no one else in this country, that Mark had been her family. After deliberating for 15 hours, the jury of 10 men and 2 women unanimously found Berlinah not guilty of the murder or manslaughter of Mark van Dongen. She was found guilty solely of her original charge of throwing a corrosive substance with intent. The judge described Berlinah's act as pure evil, and I have to say, I agree. The woman laughed as she threw sulfuric acid on her partner of 5+ years, and then sat on her couch and called her friend as he ran screaming in pain into the street. If that's not evil, I truly don't know what is. Berlinah was the first person in the UK to ever be sentenced to life in prison for an acid attack, but here's the kicker. It's life with the possibility of parole after just 12 years. And she was given credit for the 2.5 years that she'd already served before the trial. So it's really life with the possibility of parole after 9.5 years. All that boils down to is that she'll be eligible for parole in 2027, which just sounds soon. Since this case took place, the UK has made it more difficult for civilians to get a hold of chemicals like this, so I guess that's something. Obviously, as you saw before, this case really bothers me. Most acid attacks aren't carried out with the intent to kill someone, mostly just to disfigure them. So, based off of those statistics, if the prosecution couldn't prove that the intent was there, I do understand not being able to secure the murder or manslaughter charges. But the fact that she could possibly get out so soon really rubs me the wrong way. I'm sympathetic to her trauma as well. I really am. But it doesn't excuse the fact that she is clearly a dangerous person. Again, I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I'm very interested to see some perspectives other than my own, so, you know, go do your thing. With that, I've pretty much wrapped up all I have for you today. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to Mark's story. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I put out new true crime content each week, and I would love to see you back here in my next video. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.